Hello, hello, hello! Greetings, salutations, konnichiwa, and every other form of green across this vast, marvelous multiverse. I am Matsu Quinox. This is Horace, and welcome back, my dear, marvelous, wonderful scholars, to the study. Hello there, hello there, hello there. Hello there, Dr. Zadium. Congratulations on getting first. Hello there, Project Trial. Welcome. I wave back to you if I had my hand sensors. Oh, thank you for the subscription, Sophia Ignacy. Welcome. Hello there, Dr. I already said hello there, Dr. Zadium. Congratulations on the 3 stream streak, Dr. Zadium. Hello there, Yulian20. Welcome. Hello there, Private Maverick. Welcome. And thank you for the follow, Project Trial. Welcome, 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 welcome. I'm going to run out of breath before this season even begin. Welcome. Yes. Oh my goodness, oh my goodness, oh my goodness. We are still in spooky month, and we have spooky stories ready for you tonight, or tomorrow, or this morning, or this afternoon, or whenever it is, wherever it is. So, how are you, dear scholars, doing this fine day, night, evening, afternoon? How are you all doing? Of course, you, 20. Of course, you chose me to do a little bit of radio voice right off the bat. Need to get hydrated for this. Oh, you're tired, Sophia Ignacio. Oh, supposed to be a long day. Project Trial doodling. Oh, doodling is fun. And glad to hear you're fabulous, Julian20. Alright, a little more water, and then we'll do the radio voice. Good evening, all you fine scholars out there, and welcome back to Radio Matsu. Here tonight we'll be reading you some fine stories from the one and only Edith Wharton. Ghost stories to chill your spine and to make you feel fear. So sit back, relax, and enjoy yourself here at Radio Matsu. See you then. I hope that radio voice was to your liking, Julian20? Oh, good evening, Firefly. Welcome. Glad to have you here. Oh, Julian20, wonderful. Oh, thank you. Today for myself was, whew, well, it was pretty rough, honestly. Had a bit of an issue. Horace helped me through it, though. It was just, honestly, it was a rough day emotionally and physically. I honestly don't know what happened. Maybe it's the changing of the study. Maybe it's something else. I don't know. It's been one of those days. Which makes me glad to be here with all of you. You, my dear scholars, make me happy. You make me feel lucky and honored and just I am so happy to be with all of you. You make it worthwhile. Oh, thank you for the hug, Julian20. Uh, you make it all worthwhile. These stories and all these activities are for you. I do it all for you. And yes, I don't know what else to say about that. But yes, tonight, ooh, we're gonna have our first reading of Ghost Stories. Ghost Stories. Ghost Stories. Ghost Stories, actually specifically, Ghost Stories written by the American writer Edith Wharton. A little background with her, Edith Wharton, born Edith Newbold Jones. She was an American writer. She grew up in the Gilded Age, which is the American equivalent of the Victorian Age. Union 20, am I going to be able to sleep? I have no idea. I really don't know. She actually became the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for her novel The Age of Innocence. And oh, fun. Wait, I wish Wastes was here. Uh, I don't think I can. Can I ban them? Okay, let me see. Hold on a second, my dear scholars. I gotta do some cleanup here. Did I spell that right? No, I didn't. Don't want to ban the wrong person. Okay, there we are. Anywho, um, so where was I? Oh yes, yes, Edith Wharton. She won the Pulitzer Prize for her novel *The Age of Innocence*. I'm sure some of you have heard of that novel. She also wrote two other books. Well, she was famous for several books: *The House of Mirth* and *Ethan Frome*. But she is also known for writing ghost stories. And we are going to read a few of them tonight. Probably only two. They're actually quite long stories. I had heard of one of the stories before, but not the other. I had heard a radio adaptation of um, of one of these stories, which will be the first one we're going to read. Firefly. I was aware of the others, but not the ghost stories. Yes, indeed. I wasn't aware of the ghost stories either until I kind of stumbled onto them. And as luck would have it, upon my perusing, I managed to gain a copy of her ghost stories in paperback. I do have a, of course, the study has a copy of all her books, but for my own use for these reading streams, I tend to purchase ones, and I managed to find a paperback version from what year was this from? Oh my goodness, is there a date on this? 1976 edition with an interesting cover to it. Let's just say that. Um, oh, $1.75 when it first came out. By Popular Library. All right. Um, interesting. But anyway, anywho, my dear scholars, shall we dive right in to these terrifying tales? If we have time, we'll read more than one. All right. So sit back, relax, dim your lights if possible, have a hot or cold beverage, and we will begin our readings of the ghost stories of Edith Wharton. Also, I will warn you. I am probably going to cough a little bit. There has been a lot of dust and changes in the study, so my cough is kind of noticeable now. Like that. Julian 20, no dimming, no too scary. Well, we'll see. We'll see how it is. The Lady's Maid's Bell. It was the autumn after I had the typhoid. I'd been 3 months in hospital, and when I came out, I looked so weak and tottery that the 2 or 3 ladies I applied to were afraid to engage me. Most of my money was gone, and after I'd boarded for 2 months, hanging about the employment agencies and answering any advertisement that looked any way respectable, I pretty nearly lost heart, for fretting hadn't made me fatter, and I didn't see why my luck should ever turn. It did, though, or I thought so at the time. A Mrs. Railton, a friend of the lady that first brought me out to the States, met me one day and stopped to speak to me. Excuse me. She was one that had always a friendly way with her. She asked me what ailed me to look so white, and when I told her, "Why, Hartley," says she, "I believe I've got the very place for you. Come in tomorrow and we'll talk about it." The next day when I called, she told me the lady she'd in mind was a niece of hers, a Mrs. Briarmanton, a youngish lady, but something of an invalid, who lived all the year round in her country place on the Hudson, owing to not being able to stand the fatigue of town life. "Now, Hartley," Mrs. Railton said, in that cheery way that always made me feel things must be going to take a turn for the better, "now understand me. It's not a cheerful place I'm sending you to. The house is big and gloomy. My niece is nervous, vaporous. Her husband, well, he's generally away, and the two children are dead." Oh, that's sad. That's terrible. A year ago, I would as soon have thought of shutting a rosy, active girl like you into a vault. But you're not particularly brisk yourself just now, are you? Rude. And a quiet place with country air and wholesome food and early hours ought to be the very thing for you. Don't mistake me, she added, for I suppose I looked a trifle downcast. You may find it dull, but you won't be unhappy. My niece is an angel. Her former maid, who died last spring, had been with her 20 years and worshipped the ground she walked on. She's a kind mistress to all, and where the mistress is kind, as you know, the servants are generally good-humored. So you'll probably get on well enough with the rest of the household. And you're the very woman I want for my niece. Quiet, well-mannered, and educated above your station. You read aloud well, I think. That's a good thing. My niece likes to read too. She wants a maid that can be something of a companion. You see? Her last was, and I can't say how she misses her. It's a lonely life. Well, have you decided? Well, ma'am, I said, I'm not afraid of solitude. Well, then go. My niece will take you on my recommendation. I'll telegraph her at once, and you can take the afternoon train. She has no one to wait on her at present, and I don't want you to lose any time. I was ready enough to start, yet something in me hung back, and to gain time I asked, "And the gentleman, ma'am?" "The gentleman's almost always away, I'll tell you," said Mrs. Railton, quick-like. "And when he's there," says she suddenly, "you've only to keep out of his way." Well, that's not a very good sign. I took the afternoon train and got to the station at about 4 o'clock. A groom in a dog cart was waiting, and we drove off at a smart pace. It was a dull October day with rain hanging close overhead, and by the time we turned into Brympton Place Woods the daylight was almost gone. Into Brympton Place Woods the daylight was almost gone. Julian 20. How odd. Yes, very odd. The drive wound through the woods for a mile or two, and came out on a gravel court shut in with thickets of tall, black-looking shrubs. There were no lights in the windows, and the house did look a bit gloomy. I had asked no questions of the groom, for I never was one to get my notion of new masters from their other servants. I prefer to wait and see for myself. But I could tell by the look of everything that I had got into the right kind of house, and that things were done handsomely. A pleasant-faced cook met me at the back door and called the housemaid to show me up to my room. "You'll see Madam later," she said. "Mrs. Brampton has a visitor." I hadn't fancied Mrs. Brampton was a lady to have many visitors, and somehow the words cheered me. I followed the housemaid upstairs and saw through a door on the upper landing that the main part of the house seemed well furnished, with dark paneling and a number of old portraits. Another flight of stairs led up to the servants' wing. It was almost dark now, and the housemaid excused herself for not having brought a light. "But there's matches in your room," she said, "and if you go carefully you'll be all right. Mind the step at the end of the passage. Your room is just beyond." I looked ahead as she spoke, and halfway down the passage I saw a woman standing. She drew back into a doorway as we passed, and the housemaid didn't appear to notice her. She was a thin woman, with a white face and a dark gown and apron. I took her for the housekeeper and thought it odd that she didn't speak, but just gave me a long look as she went by. My room opened into a square hall at the end of the passage. Facing my door was another which stood open. The housemaid exclaimed when she saw it. "There! Mrs. Blinders left that door open again," said she, closing it. "Is Mrs. Blinder the housekeeper?" "There's no housekeeper. Mrs. Blinder's the cook." "And is that her room?" "Laws, no," said the housemaid cross-like. That's nobody's room. It's empty, I mean, and though the door hadn't ought to be open. Mrs. Brampton wants it kept locked. I wonder why." She opened my door and led me into a neat room, nicely furnished, with a picture or two on the walls, and having lit a candle she took leave, telling me that the servants' hall tea was at 6, and that Mrs. Brampton would see me afterward. I found them a pleasant-spoken set in the servants' hall, and by what they let fall I gathered that, as Mrs. Railton had said, Mrs. Brampton was the kindest of ladies, but I didn't take much notice of their talk, for I was watching to see the pale woman in the dark gown come in. She didn't show herself, however, and I wondered if she ate apart. But if she wasn't the housekeeper, why should she? Suddenly it struck me that she might be a trained nurse, and in that case her meals would of course be served in her room. If Mrs. Brampton was an invalid, it was likely enough she had a nurse. The idea annoyed me, I own, for they're not always the easiest to get on with, and if I'd known I wouldn't have taken the place. But there I was, and there was no use pulling a long face over it, and not being one to ask questions, I waited to see what would turn up. Another drink of water. When tea was over, the housemaid said to the footman, "Has Mr. Ranford gone?" And when he said yes, she told me to come up with her to Mrs. Brampton. Mrs. Brampton was lying down in her bedroom. Her lounge stood near the fire, and beside it was a shaded lamp. She was a delicate-looking lady, but when she smiled I felt there was nothing I wouldn't do for her. She spoke very pleasantly, in a low voice, asking me my name and age and so on, and if I had everything I wanted, and if I wasn't afraid of feeling lonely in the country. "Not with you I wouldn't be, madam," I said, and the words surprised me when I spoken them, for I'm not an impulsive person, but it was just as if I'd thought aloud. She seemed pleased at that, and said she hoped I'd continue in the same mind. Then she gave me a few directions about her toilet, and said Agnes, the housemaid, would show me next morning where things were kept. "I'm tired tonight, and shall dine upstairs," she said. "Agnes will bring me my tray, so that you may have time to unpack and settle yourself, and later you may come and undress me." "Very well, ma'am," I said. "You'll ring, I suppose?" I thought she looked odd. "No, Agnes will fetch you," said she quickly, and took up her book again. Well, That was certainly strange. A lady's maid having to be fetched by the housemaid whenever her lady wanted her. I wondered if there were no bells in the house. But the next day I satisfied myself that there was one in every room, and a special one reading from my mistress's room to mine. And after that it did strike me as queer that whenever Mrs. Brampton wanted anything, she rang for Agnes, who had to walk the whole length of the servants' wing to call me. But that wasn't the only queer thing in the house. The very next day I found out that Mrs. Brampton had no nurse, and then I asked Agnes about the woman I had seen in the passage the afternoon before. Agnes said she had seen no one, and I saw that she thought I was dreaming. To be sure, it was dusk when we went down the passage, and she had excused herself for not bringing a light, but I had seen the woman plain enough to know her again if we should meet. I decided that she must have been a friend of the cook's, or of one of the other women's servants. Perhaps she had come down from town for a night's visit, and the servants wanted it kept secret. Some ladies are very stiff about having their servants' friends in the house overnight. At any rate, I made up my mind to ask no more questions. In a day or two, another odd thing happened. I was chatting one afternoon with Mrs. Blinder, who was a friendly disposed woman, and had been longer in the house than the other servants. And she asked me if I was quite comfortable and had everything I needed. I said I had no fault to find with my place or with my mistress, but I thought it odd that in so large a house there was no sewing room for the lady's maid. "Why," says she, "there is one. The room you're in is the old sewing room." "Oh?" said I. "And where did the other lady's maid sleep?" At this she grew confused, and said hurriedly that the servants' rooms had all been changed about last year, and she didn't rightly remember. That struck me as peculiar, but I went on as if I hadn't noticed. "Well, there's a vacant room opposite mine, and I mean to ask Mrs. Brampton if I mayn't use that as a sewing room." To my astonishment, Mrs. Blinder went white and gave my hand a kind of squeeze. "Don't do that, my dear," said she, trembling like. "To tell you the truth, that was Emma Saxon's room, and my mistress has kept it closed ever since her death." "And who was Emma Saxon?" "Mrs. Brampton's former maid." "The one that was with her so many years," said I, remembering what Mrs. Railton had told me. Mrs. Blinder nodded. "What sort of woman was she?" "No better walk the earth," said Mrs. Blinder. "My mistress loved her like a sister. But, I mean, what did she look like?" Mrs. Blinder got up and gave me a kind of angry stare. "I'm no great hand at describing," she said, "and I believe my pasty's rising." And she walked off into the kitchen and shut the door after her. This story, by the way, is divided into sections, just so you know. 2. I had been near a week at Brampton before I saw my master. Word came that he was arriving one afternoon, and a change passed over the whole household. It was plain that nobody loved him below stairs. The servants often lived and operated in the basement area. So if you've ever heard of upstairs, downstairs, that sort of thing, servants are always downstairs. The upper class are always upstairs. That's what it's a reference to. It was plain that nobody loved him below stairs. Mrs. Blinder took uncommon care with the dinner that night, but she snapped at the kitchen maid in a way quite unusual with her. And Mr. Wace, the butler, a serious, slow-spoken man, went about his duties as if he'd been getting ready for a funeral. He was a great Bible reader, Mr. Wace was, and had a beautiful assortment of texts at his command. But that day he used such dreadful language that I was about to leave the table when he assured me it was all out of Isaiah, and I noticed that whenever the master came, Mr. Wace took to the prophets. About 7, Agnes called me to my mistress's room, and there I found Mr. Brampton. He was standing on the hearth, a big, fair, bull-necked man, with a red face and little bad-tempered blue eyes. The kind of man a young simpleton might have thought handsome, and would have been like to pay dear for thinking it. Excuse me. He swung about when I came in and looked me over in a trice. I knew what the look meant, from having experienced it once or twice in my former places. Then he turned his back on me and went on talking to his wife, and I knew what that meant too. I was not the kind of morsel he was after. The typhoid had served me well enough in one way. It kept that kind of gentleman at arm's length. Ooh, so he's that sort of person. Ugh. That is my new maid, Hartley, said Mrs. Brampton in her kind voice, and he nodded and went on with what he was saying. In a minute or two he went off and left my mistress to dress for dinner, and I noticed as I waited on her that she was white and chill to the touch. Mr. Brampton took himself off the next morning, and the whole house drew a long breath when he drove away. As for my mistress, she put on her hat and furs, for it was a fine winter morning, and went out for a walk in the gardens, coming back quite fresh and rosy, so that for a minute before her color faded I could guess what a pretty young lady she must have been, and not so long ago either. She had met Mr. Ranford in the grounds, and the two came back together. I remember smiling and talking as they walked along the terrace under my window. That was the first time I saw Mr. Ranford, though I had often heard his name mentioned in the hall. He was a neighbor, it appeared, living a mile or two beyond Brampton, at the end of the village, and as he was in the habit of spending his winter in the country, he was almost the only company my mistress had at that season. He was a slight, tall gentleman of about 30, and I thought him rather melancholy looking, till I saw his smile, which had a kind of surprise in it, like the first warm day in spring. He was a great reader, I heard, like my mistress, and the two were forever borrowing books of one another, and sometimes, Mr. Wace told me, he would read aloud to Mrs. Brampton by the hour, in the big dark library where she sat in the winter afternoons. The servants all liked him, and perhaps that's more of a compliment than the master suspect. Than the masters suspect. He had a friendly word for every one of us, and we were all glad to think that Mrs. Brampton had a pleasant, companionable gentleman like that to keep her company when the master was away. Mr. Ranford seemed on excellent terms with Mr. Brampton, too, though I couldn't but wonder that the two gentlemen so unlike each other should be so friendly. But then I knew how the real quality can keep their feelings to themselves. As for Mr. Brampton, he came and went, never staying more than a day or two, cursing the dullness and solitude, grumbling at everything, and, as I soon found out, drinking a deal more than was good for him. After Mrs. Brampton left the table he would sit half the night over the old Brampton port and Madeira, and once, as I was leaving my mistress's room rather later than usual, I met him coming up the stairs in such a state that I turned sick to think of what some ladies have to endure and hold their tongues about. The servants said very little about their master, but from what they let drop I could see it had been an unhappy match from the beginning. Mr. Brampton was coarse, loud, and pleasure-loving. My mistress quiet, retiring, and perhaps a trifle cold. Not that she was not always pleasant spoken to him. I thought her wonderfully forbearing, but to a gentleman as free as Mr. Brampton I dare say she seemed a little offish. Well, things went on quietly for several weeks. My mistress was kind, my duties were light, and I got on well with the other servants. In short, I had nothing to complain of. Yet there was always a weight on me. I can't say why it was so, but I know it was not the loneliness that I felt. I soon got used to that, and being still languid from the fever, I was thankful for the quiet and the good country air. Nevertheless, I was never quite easy in my mind. My mistress, knowing I had been ill, insisted that I should take my walk regularly, and often invented errands for me. A yard of ribbon to be fetched from the village, a letter posted, or a book returned to Mr. Ranford. As soon as sorry, as soon as I was out of doors, my spirit rose, and I looked forward to my walks throughout the bare, moist-smelling woods. But the moment I caught sight of the house again, my heart dropped down like a stone in a well. It was not a gloomy house exactly, yet I never entered it, but a feeling of gloom came over me. Mrs. Brampton seldom went out in winter. Only on the finest days did she walk an hour at noon on the south terrace. Excepting Mr. Ranford, we had no visitors, but the doctor, who drove over from town about once a week. He sent for me once or twice to give me some trifling direction about my mistress, and though he never told me what her illness was, I thought, from a waxy look she had now and then of a morning, that it might be the heart that ailed her. The season was soft and unwholesome, and in January we had a long spell of rain. That was a that was a sore trial to me, I own, for I couldn't go out, and sitting over my sewing all day, listening to the drip, drip of the eaves, I grew so nervous that the least sound made me jump. Somehow, the thought of that locked room across the passage began to weigh on me. Once or twice, in the long rainy nights, I fancied I'd heard noises there. But that was nonsense, of course, and the daylight drove such notions out of my head. Well, one morning Mrs. Bramford gave me quite a start of pleasure by telling me she wished me to go to town for some shopping. I hadn't known till then how low my spirits had fallen. I set off in high glee, and my first sight of the crowded streets and the cheerful-looking shops quite took me out of myself. Toward afternoon, however, the noise and confusion began to tire me, and I was actually looking forward to the quiet of Brampton, and thinking how I should enjoy the drive home through the dark woods, when I ran across an old acquaintance, a maid I had once been in service with. We had lost sight of each other for a number of years, and I had to stop and tell her what had happened to me in the interval. When I mentioned where I was living, she rolled up her eyes and pulled a long face. "What? The Mrs. Brampton that lives all the year at her place on the Hudson? My dear, you won't stay there 3 months." "Oh, but I don't mind the country," says I, offended somehow at her tone. "Since the fever, I'm glad to be quiet." She shook her head. "It's not the country I'm thinking of. All I know is she's had 4 maids in the last 6 months, and the last one, who was a friend of mine, told me nobody could stay in the house. Did she say why? I asked. No, she wouldn't give me her reason. But she says to me, Mrs. Ainsley, she says, if ever a young woman as you know of thinks of going there, you tell her it's not worth while to unpack her boxes. Is she young and handsome? Said I, thinking of Mr. Brampton. Not her. She's the kind that mothers engage when they've gay young gentlemen at college. Well, though I knew the woman was an idle gossip, the words stuck in my head, and my heart sank lower than ever as I drove up to Brampton in the dusk. There was something about the house. I was sure of it now. When I went in to tea, I heard that Mr. Brampton had arrived, and I saw at a glance that there had been a disturbance of some kind. Mrs. Blinder's hand shook so that she could hardly pour the tea, and Mr. Wace quoted the most dreadful texts full of brimstone. Nobody said a word to me then, but when I went up to my room, Mrs. Blinder followed me. "Oh, my dear," says she, taking my hand, "I'm so glad and thankful you've come back to us." That struck me, as you might imagine. "Why?" said I. "Did you think I was leaving for good?" "No, no, to be sure," said she, a little confused. "But I can't bear to have Madam left alone for a day even." She pressed my hand hard and said, "Oh, Miss Hartley," says she, "be good to your mistress, as you're a Christian woman." And with that she hurried away and left me staring. A moment later Agnes called me to Mrs. Brampton. Hearing Mr. Brampton's voice in her room, I went round by the dressing room, thinking I would lay out her dinner gown before going in. The dressing room is a large room with a window over the portico that looks towards the gardens. Mr. Brampton's apartments are beyond. When I went in, the door into the bedroom was ajar, and I heard Mr. Brampton saying angrily, "One would suppose he was the only person fit for you to talk to." "I don't have many visitors in winter," Mrs. Brampton answered quietly. "You have me," he flung at her sneeringly. "You are here so seldom," said she. "Well, whose fault is that? You make the place about as lively as the family vault." With that I rattled the toilet things to give my mistress warning, and she rose and called me in. Give me a second. Another drink of water. Julian 20 horrible. Yes, yes. This husband of hers sounds like an absolute horrible person. Excuse me. The two dined alone as usual, and I knew by Mr. Wace's manner at supper that things must be going badly. He quoted the prophet something terrible, and worked on the kitchen maid so that she declared she wouldn't go down alone to put the cold meat in the icebox. I felt nervous myself, and after I had put my mistress to bed, I was half tempted to go down again, and persuade Mrs. Blinder to sit up a while over a game of cards. But I heard her door closing for the night, and so I went on to my own room. The rain had begun again, and the drip, drip, drip seemed to be dropping into my brain. I lay awake listening to it, and turning over what my friend in town had said. What puzzled me was that it was always the maids who left. After a while I slept. But suddenly a loud noise wakened me. My bell had run. I sat up, terrified by the unusual sound, which seemed to go on jangling through the darkness. Oh, excuse me. My hands shook so that I couldn't find the matches. At length, I struck a light and jumped out of bed. I began to think I must have been dreaming, but I looked at the bell against the wall, and there was the little hammer, still quivering. I was just beginning to huddle on my clothes when I heard another sound. This time it was the door of the locked room opposite mine, softly opening and closing. I heard the sound distinctly, and it frightened me so that I stood stock still. Then I heard a footstep hurrying down the passage toward the main house. The floor being carpeted, the sound was very faint, but I was quite sure it was a woman's step. I turned cold with the thought of it, and for a minute or two I durst breathe or move. Then I came to my senses. Alice Hartley, says I to myself, someone left that room just now and ran down the passage ahead of you. The idea isn't pleasant, but you may as well face it. Your mistress has run for you, and to answer her bell you've got to go the way that other woman has gone. Well, I did it. I never walked faster in my life, yet I thought I should never get to the end of the passage or reach Mrs. Brampton's room. On the way I heard nothing and saw nothing. All was dark and quiet as the grave. When I reached my mistress's door, the silence was so deep that I began to think I must be dreaming, and I was half-minded to turn back. Then a panic seized me, and I knocked. There was no answer, and I knocked again loudly. To my astonishment, the door was opened by Mr. Brampton. He started back when he saw me, and in the light of my candle his face looked red and savage. "You!" he said in a queer voice. "How many of you are there, in God's name?" At that I felt the ground give under me, but I said to myself that that he had been drinking, and answered as steadily as I could, "May I go in, sir? Mrs. Brampton has run for me." Julian 20, what? What? Yes, indeed, what? "You may all go in, for what I care," says he, and pushing by me, walked down the hall to his own bedroom. I looked after him as he went, and to my surprise I saw that he walked as straight as a sober man. I found my mistress lying very weak and still, but she forced a smile when she saw me, and signed to me to pour out some drops for her. After that she lay without speaking, her breath coming quick, and her eyes closed. Suddenly she groped out with her hand, and "Emma," says she faintly. "It's Hartley, madam," I said. "Do you want anything?" She opened her eyes wide and gave me a startled look. "I was dreaming," she said. "You may go now, Hartley, and thank you kindly. I'm quite well again, you see." and she turned her face away from me. Well, this is getting interesting. 3. There was no more sleep for me that night, and I was thankful when daylight came. Soon afterward, Agnes called me to Mrs. Brampton. I was afraid she was ill again, for she seldom sent for me before 9, but I found her sitting up in bed, pale and drawn looking, but quite herself. "Hartley," says she quickly, "will you put on your things at once and go down to the village for me? I want this prescription made up." Here she hesitated a minute and blushed. "And I should like you to be back again before Mr. Brampton is up." "Certainly, madam," I said, "and stay a moment." She called me back as if an idea had just struck her. "While you're waiting for the mixture, you'll have time to go on to Mr. Ranford's with this note." It was a 2-mile walk to the village, and on my way I had time to turn things over in my mind. It struck me as peculiar that my mistress should wish the prescription made up without Mr. Brampton's knowledge, and putting this together with the scene of the night before and with much else that I had noticed and suspected, I began to wonder if the poor lady was weary of her life and had come to the mad resolve of ending it. The idea took such a hold on me that I reached the village on a run and dropped breathless into a chair before the chemist's counter. The good man, who was just taking down his shutters, stared at me so hard that it brought me to myself. "Mr. Lemmel," I says, trying to speak indifferently, "will you run your eye over this and tell me if it's quite right?" He put on his spectacles and studied the prescription. "Why, it's one of Dr. Walton's," says he. "What should be wrong with it?" "Well, is it dangerous to take?" "Dangerous? How do you mean?" I could have shaken the man for his stupidity. "I mean, if a person was to take too much of it, by mistake, of course," says I, my heart in my throat. "Lord bless you, no! It's only lime water. You might feed it to a baby by the bottleful." I gave a great sigh of relief and hurried on to Mr. Rainford's. But on the way, another thought struck me. If there was nothing to conceal about my visit to the chemist's, was it my other errand that Mrs. Brampton wished me to keep private? Somehow that thought frightened me worse than the other. Yet the two gentlemen seemed fast friends, and I would have staked my head on my mistress's goodness. I felt ashamed of my suspicions and concluded that I was still disturbed by the strange events of the night. I left the note at Mr. Ranford's and hurried back to Brampton, slipped in by a side door without being seen, as I thought. An hour later, however, as I was carrying in my mistress's breakfast, I was stopped in the hall by Mr. Brampton. "What were you doing out so early?" he says, looking hard at me. "Early? Me, sir?" I said in a tremble. "Come, come," he says, an angry red spot coming out on his forehead. "Didn't I see you scuttling home through the shrubbery an hour or more ago?" I'm a truthful woman by nature, but at that a lie popped out ready-made. "No, sir, you didn't," said I, and looked straight back at him. He shrugged his shoulders and gave a sullen laugh. Suppose you think I was drunk last night? He asked suddenly. No, sir, I don't, I answered, this time truthfully. He turned away with another shrug. A pretty notion my servants have of me, I heard him mutter as he walked off. Not till I had settled down to my afternoon sewing did I realize how the events of the night had shaken me. I couldn't pass that locked door without a shiver. I knew I had heard someone come out of it and walk down the passage ahead of me. I thought of speaking to Mrs. Blinder or to Mr. Wace, the only two in the house who appeared to have an inkling of what was going on. But I had a feeling that if I questioned them, they would deny everything, and that I might learn more by holding my tongue and keeping my eyes open. See? The idea of spending another night opposite the locked room sickened me, and once I was seized with the notion of packing my trunk and taking the first train to town. But it wasn't in me to throw over a kind mistress in that manner, and I tried to go on with my sewing as if nothing had happened. I hadn't worked 10 minutes before the sewing machine broke down. It was one I had found in the house, a good machine, but a trifle out of order. Julian 20, she should have left. Yeah, I think I kind of agree with you. She should have left. Mrs. Blinder had said it had never been used. Yeah. Mrs. Blinder said it had never been used since Emma Saxon's death. I stopped to see what was wrong, and as I was working at the machine, a drawer which I had never been able to open slid forward, and a photograph fell out. I picked it up and sat looking at it in amaze. It was a woman's likeness, and I knew I had seen the face somewhere. The eyes had an asking look that I had felt on me before. And suddenly, I remembered the pale woman in the passage. I stood up cold all over and ran out of the room. My heart seemed to be thumping at the top of my head, and I felt as if I should never get away from the look in those eyes. I went straight to Mrs. Blinder. She was taking her afternoon nap and sat up with a jump when I came in. Mrs. Blinder, said I, who is that? And I held out the photograph. She rubbed her eyes and stared. Why, Emma Saxon, says she. Where did you find it? I looked hard at her for a minute. Mrs. Blinder, I said, I've seen that face before. Mrs. Blinder got up and walked over to the looking glass. Dear me, I must have been asleep, she says. My front is all over one ear. And now do run along, Miss Hartley, dear, for I hear the clock just striking 4, and I must go down this very minute and put on the Virginia ham for Mrs. Brampton's dinner. Excuse me again. 4. Excuse me. To all appearances, things went on as usual for a week or two. The only difference was that Mr. Brampton stayed on, instead of going off as he usually did, and that Mr. Ranford never showed himself. I heard Mr. Brampton remark on this one afternoon when he was sitting in my mistress's room before dinner. "Where's Ranford?" says he. "He hasn't been near the house for a week. Does he keep away because I'm here?" Mrs. Brampton spoke so low that I couldn't catch her answer. "Well," he went on, "two's company and three's trumpery. I'm sorry to be in Ranford's way. I suppose I shall have to take myself off again in a day or two and give him a show." And he laughed at his own joke. The very next day, as it happened, Mr. Ranford called. The footman said the three were very merry over their tea in the library, and Mr. Brampton strolled down to the gate with Mr. Ranford when he left. I have said that things went on as usual, and so they did with the rest of the household. But as for myself, I had never been the same since the night my bell had run. Oh, hello there, Blah Blah. Welcome. What's up, you party animal? Life of the party, MFer, you absolute legend. Oh, I'm reading some ghost stories written by Edith Wharton. And it's very much not a party in this story, I'll tell you that. Unfortunately. Although I could use a party soon enough. It would be nice, wouldn't it? Just to have a little bit of fun. Hmm. Where was I? Night after night, I used to lie awake, listening for it to ring again, and for the door of the locked room to open stealthily. But the bell never rang, and I heard no sound across the passage. At last the silence began to be more dreadful to me than the most mysterious sounds. I felt that someone was cowering there behind the locked door, watching and listening as I watched and listened, and I could almost have cried out, "Whoever you are, come out and let me see you face to face, but don't lurk there and spy on me in the darkness." Blah blah. I like how no matter what the subject matter of the book you're reading, Horace always looks happy. Nothing phases him at all. I envy that. Oh yes, Horace is phased by nothing, trust me. He is completely immune to everything. And Horace says hello, blah blah, of course. Feeling as I did, you may wonder I didn't give warning. Once I very nearly did so, but at the last moment something held me back. Whether it was compassion for my mistress who had grown more and more dependent on me, or unwillingness to try a new place, or some other feeling that I couldn't put a name to, I lingered on as if spellbound, though every night was dreadful to me, and the days but little better. For one thing, I didn't like Mrs. Brampton's looks. She had never been the same since that night, no more than I had. I thought she would brighten up after Mr. Brampton left, but though she seemed easier in her mind, her spirits didn't revive, nor her strength either. She had grown attached to me and seemed to like to have me about, and Agnes told me one day that since Emma Saxon's death, it was the only maid her mistress had taken. I was the only maid her mistress had taken to. This gave me a warm feeling for the poor lady, though after all there was little I could do to help her. After Mr. Brampton's departure, Mr. Rainford took to coming again, though less often than formerly. I met him once or twice in the grounds or in the village, and I couldn't but think there was a change in him too, but I set it down to my disordered fancy. The weeks passed, and Mr. Brampton had now been a month absent. We heard he was cruising with a friend in the West Indies, and Mr. Wace said that was a long way off. But though you had the wings of a dove and went the uttermost parts of the earth, you couldn't get away from the Almighty. Agnes said that as long as he stayed away from Brampton, the Almighty might have him and welcome, and this raised a laugh, though Mrs. Blinder tried to look shocked, and Mr. Wace said the bears would eat us. Again, another drink. We were all glad to hear that the West Indies were a long way off, and I remember that in spite of Mr. Wace's solemn looks, he had a very merry dinner that day in the hall. We had a very merry dinner that day in the hall. I don't know if it was because of my being in better spirits, but I fancied Mrs. Brampton looked better too, and seemed more cheerful in her manner. She had been for a walk in the morning, and after luncheon she lay down in her room, and I read aloud to her. When she dismissed me, I went to my own room, feeling quite bright and happy, and for the first time in weeks walked past the locked door without thinking of it. As I sat down to my work, I looked out and saw a few snowflakes falling. The sight was pleasanter than the eternal rain, and I pictured to myself how pretty the bare gardens would look in their white mantle. It seemed to me as if the snow would cover all the dreariness, indoors as well as out. The fancy had hardly crossed my mind when I heard a step at my side. I looked up, thinking it was Agnes. "Well, Agnes," said I, and the words froze on my tongue. For there in the door stood Emma Saxon. I don't know how long she stood there. I only know I couldn't stir or take my eyes from her. Afterward, I was terribly frightened. But at the time, it wasn't fear I felt, but something deeper and quieter. She looked at me long and hard, and her face was just one dumb prayer to me. But how in the world was I to help her? Suddenly she turned, and I heard her walk down the passage. This time I wasn't afraid to follow. I felt that I must know what she wanted. I sprang up and ran out. She was at the other end of the passage, and I expected her to take the turn toward my mistress's room, but instead of that she pushed open the door that led to the back stairs. I followed her down the stairs and across the passageway to the back door. The kitchen and hall were empty at that hour, the servants being off duty, except for the footman, who was in the pantry. At the door she stood still a moment, with another look at me. Then she turned the handle and stepped out. For a minute I hesitated. Where was she leading me to? The door had closed softly after her, and I opened it and looked out, half expecting to find that she had disappeared. But I saw her a few yards off, hurriedly down across the courtyard to the path across the woods. Her figure looked black and lonely in the snow, and for a second my heart failed me, and I thought of turning back, but all the while she was drawing me after her, and catching up an old shawl of Mrs. Blinder's, I ran out into the open. Emma Saxon was in the wood path now. She walked on steadily, and I followed at the same pace till we passed out of the gates and reached the high road. Then she struck across the open fields to the village. By this time the ground was white, and as she climbed the slope of a bare hill ahead of me, I noticed she left no footprints behind her. At sight of that, my heart shriveled up within me, and my knees were water. Somehow it was worse here than indoors. She made the whole countryside seem lonely as the grave, with none but us two in it, and no help in the wide world. Second, let me get a drink. Once I tried to go back, but she turned and looked at me, and it was as if she had dragged me with ropes. After that, I followed her like a dog. We came to the village, and she led me through it, past the church and the blacksmith shop, and down the lane to Mr. Rainford's. Mr. Rainford's house stands close to the road, a plain old-fashioned building with a flagged path leading to the door between box borders. The lane was deserted, and as I turned into it, I saw Emma Saxon pause under the old elm by the gate. And now another fear came over me. I saw that we had reached the end of our journey and that it was my turn to act. All the way from Brampton I had been asking myself what she wanted of me, but I had followed in a trance as it were, and not till I saw her stop at Mr. Rainford's gate did my brain begin to clear itself. I stood a little way off in the snow, and my heart beating fit to strangle me, and my feet froze into the ground. And she stood under the elm and watched me. I knew enough that she hadn't led me there for nothing. I felt there was something I ought to say or do. But how was I to guess what it was? I had never thought harm of my mistress and Mr. Rainford, but I was sure now that from one cause or another some dreadful thing hung over them. She knew what it was. She would tell me if she could. Perhaps she would answer if I questioned her. It turned me faint to think of speaking to her, but I plucked up my heart and dragged myself across the few yards between us. As I did so, I heard the house door open and saw Mr. Rainford approaching. He looked handsome and cheerful as my mistress had looked that morning, and at sight of him the blood began to flow again in my veins. "Why, Hartley," said he, "what's the matter? I saw you coming down the lane just now and came out to see if you had taken root in the snow." He stopped and stared at me. "What are you looking at?" he says. I turned toward the elm as he spoke, and his eyes followed me, but there was no one there. The lane was empty as far as the eye could reach. A sense of helplessness came over me. She was gone, and I had not been able to guess what she wanted. Her last look had pierced me to the marrow, and yet it had not told me. All at once I felt more desolate than when she had stood there watching me. It seemed as if she had left me all alone to carry the weight of the secret I couldn't guess. The snow went round me in great circles, and the ground fell away from me. A drop of brandy and the warmth of Mr. Rainford's fire soon brought me to, and I insisted on being driven back at once to Brampton. It was nearly dark, and I was afraid my mistress might be wanting me. I expected to Mr. Rainford that I had been out. I explained to Mr. Rainford I had been out for a walk and had been taken with a fit of giddiness as I passed his gate. This was true enough, yet I never felt more like a liar than when I said it. When I dressed Mrs. Brampton, yeah, let me get a drink of water again. When I dressed Mrs. Brampton for dinner, she remarked on my pale looks and asked what ailed me. I told her I had a headache, and she said she would not require me again that evening and advised me to go to bed. It was a fact that I could scarcely keep on my feet, yet I had no fancy to spend a solitary evening in my room. I sat downstairs in the hall as long as I could hold my head up, but by 9 I crept upstairs, too weary to care what happened if I could but get my head on a pillow. The rest of the household went to bed soon afterward. They kept early hours when the master was away, and before 10 I heard Mrs. Blinder's door close, and Mr. Wace's soon after. It was a very still night. Earth and air all muffled in snow. Once in bed I felt easier, and lay quiet, listening to the strange noises that come out in a house after dark. Once I thought I heard a door open and close again below. It might have been the glass door that led to the gardens. I got up and peered out of the window, but it was in the dark of the moon, and nothing visible outside but the streaking of snow against the panes. I went back to bed and must have dozed, for I jumped awake to the furious ringing of my bell. Before my head was clear, I had sprung out of bed and was dragging on my clothes. "It is going to happen now," I heard myself saying, but what I meant I had no notion. My hands seemed to be covered with glue. I thought I should never get into my clothes. At last I opened my door and peered down the passage. As far as my candle flame carried, I could see nothing unusual ahead of me. I hurried on breathlessly, but as I pushed open the baize door leading to the main hall, my heart stood still. For there, at the head of the stairs, was Emma Saxon, peering dreadfully down into the darkness. For a second I couldn't stir, but my hand slipped from the door, and as it swung shut, the figure vanished. At the same instant there came another sound from below stairs, a stealthy, mysterious sound, as of a latchkey turning in the house door. I ran to Mrs. Brampton's room and knocked. There was no answer, and I knocked again. This time I heard someone moving in the room. The bolt slipped back, and my mistress stood before me. To my surprise, I saw that she had not undressed for the night. She gave me a startled look. "What is this, Hartley?" she says in a whisper. "Are you ill? What are you doing here at this hour?" I am not ill, madam, but my bell rang." At this she turned pale, and seemed about to fall. "You are mistaken," she said harshly. "I didn't ring. You must have been dreaming." I had never heard her speak in such a tone. "Go back to bed," she said, closing the door on me. But as she spoke I heard sounds again in the hall below. A man stepped this time, and the truth leaped out on me. "Madam," I said, pushing past her, "there is someone in the house." "Someone? Mr. Brampton, I think. I hear his step below." A dreadful look came over her, and without a word she dropped flat at my feet. I fell on my knees and tried to lift her. By the way she breathed, I saw it was no common faint. But as I raised her head, there came quick steps on the stairs and across the hall. The door was flung open, and there stood Mr. Brampton in his traveling clothes, the snow dripping from him. He drew back with a start as he saw me kneeling by my mistress. "What the devil is this?" he shouted. He was less high-colored than usual, and the red spot came out on his forehead. "Mrs. Brampton has fainted, sir," said I. He laughed unsteadily and pushed by me. "It's a pity. She didn't choose a more convenient moment. I'm sorry to disturb her, but I raised myself up aghast at that man's action. Sir, said I, are you mad? What are you doing? Going to meet a friend, said he, and seemed to make for the dressing room. Julian 20, nasty man. Nasty man, yes, a very nasty man. At that, my heart turned over. I don't know what I thought or feared, but I sprang up and caught him by the sleeve. Sir, sir, said I, for pity's sake, look at your wife. He shook me off furiously. It seems that's done for me, says he, and caught hold of the dressing room. At that moment I heard a slight noise inside. Slight as it was, he heard it too, and tore the door open. But as he did so, he dropped back. On the threshold stood Emma Saxon. All was dark behind her, but I saw her plainly, and so did he. He threw up his hands as if to hide his face from her, and when I looked again, she was gone. He stood motionless, as if the strength had run out of him. And in the stillness, my mistress suddenly raised herself, and opening her eyes, fixed a look on him. Then she fell back, and I saw the death flutter past over her face. We buried her on the third day in a driving snowstorm. There were few people in the church, for it was bad weather to come from town, and I have a notion my mistress was one that hadn't many near friends. Mr. Ranford was among the last to come, just before they carried her up the aisle. He was in black, of course, being so pale. As he passed me, I noticed that he leaned a trifle on a stick he carried, and I fancy Mr. Brampton noticed it too, for the red spot came out sharp on his forehead, and all through the service he kept staring across the church at Mr. Rainford, instead of following the prayers as a mourner should. When it was over, we went out to the graveyard. Mr. Ranford had disappeared, and as soon as my poor mistress's body was underground, Mr. Brampton jumped into the carriage nearest the gate and drove off without a word to any of us. I heard him call out, "To the station!" and we servants went back alone to the house. That was The Lady's Maid's Bell. We're going to take a very short break, and I will be back for the second story of this night. So enjoy this intermission. We're back, my dear scholars. Hope you enjoyed that story. It's probably her most famous ghost story. It has been adapted for radio. Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's Nightfall did a adaptation of it, and I believe it was also adapted as a short film. I swear I have seen it somewhere. So yes. So we are going to move on to our second and final story for the night, which is a little bit shorter, not by much. Most of her stories are fairly long stories. But yes, to our next story, The Eyes. Excuse me. We had been put in the mood for ghosts that evening, after an excellent dinner at our old friend Colwyn's, Colwyn's, by a tale of Fred Mulker's, the narrative of a strange personal visitation. Firefly, thank you. I'm really tired and going to head to bed. Ah, well, have a good night, Firefly. Thank you for coming. Seen through the haze of our cigars and by the drowsy gleam of a coal fire, Culwyn's library, with its oak walls and dark old bindings, made a good setting for such evocations, and ghostly experiences at first hand being after Mulchin's opening, the only kind acceptable to us. We proceeded to take stock of our group and tax each member for a contribution. There were 8 of us, and 7 contrived, in a manner more or less adequate, to fulfill the condition imposed. It surprised us all to find that we could muster such a show of supernatural impressions, for none of us, excepting Mulchard himself and young Phil Frenham, whose story was the slightest of the lot, had the habit of sending our souls into the invisible, so that on the whole we had every reason to be proud of our 7 exhibits, and none of us would have dreamed of expecting an 8th from our host. Our old friend, Mr. Andrew Culwyn, who had sat back in his armchair listening and blinking through the smoke circles with the cheerful tolerance of a wise old idol, was not the kind of man likely to be favored with such contacts, though he had imagination enough to enjoy, without envying, the superior privileges of his guests. By age and by education, he belonged to the stout positivist tradition, and his habit of thought had been formed in the days of the epic struggle between physics and metaphysics. But he had been, then and always, essentially a spectator, a humorous, detached observer of the immense muddled variety show of life, slipping out of his seat now and then for a brief dip into the convalities at the back of the house, but never, as far as one knew, showing the least desire to jump on the stage and do a turn. Among his contemporaries there lingered a vague tradition of his having, at a remote period and in a romantic clime, been wounded in a duel, but this legend no more tallied with what we younger men knew of his character than my mother's assertion that he had once been a charming little man with nice eyes corresponded to any possible reconstruction of his physiognomy. Reconstitution of his physiognomy, excuse me. He never can have looked like anything but a bundle of sticks, Mulchard had once said of him, or a phosphorescent log, rather. Someone else amended, and we recognized the happiness of this description of his small, squat trunk, not truck, trunk, with the red blink of the eyes and a face like mottled bark. He had always been possessed of a leisure which he had nursed and protected instead of squandering it in vain activities. His carefully guarded hours had been devoted to the cultivation of a fine intelligence and a few judiciously chosen habits, and none of the disturbances common to human experience seemed to have crossed his sky. Nevertheless, his dispassionate survey of the universe had not raised his opinion of that costly experiment, and his study of the human race seemed to have resulted in the conclusion that all men were superfluous, and women necessary only because someone had to do the cooking. Oh my goodness. Well, that hasn't aged well. On the importance of this point, his convictions were absolute, and gastronomy was the only science which he revered as a dogma. It must be owned that his little dinners were a strong argument in favor of this view, besides being a reason, though not the main one, for the fidelity of his friends. Mentally, he exercised a hospitality less seductive, but no less stimulating. His mind was like a forum or some open meeting place for the exchange of ideas. Somewhat cold and draughty, but light, spacious, and orderly. A kind of academic grove from which all the leaves have fallen. In this privileged area, a dozen of us were wont to stretch out our muscles and expand our lungs, and as if to prolong as much as possible the tradition of what we felt to be a vanishing institution, one or two neophytes were now and then added to our band. Young Phil Frenham was the last, and the most interesting of these recruits, and a good example of Merchant's somewhat morbid assertion that our old friend liked 'em juicy. It was indeed a fact that Colwyn, for all his dryness, especially tasted the lyric qualities in youth. As he was far too good an Epicurean to nip flowers, yeah, the flowers of soul which he gathered for his garden, his friendship was not a disinteresting influence. On the contrary, it forced the young idea to rebolster bloom, and in Phil Frenham he had a good subject for experimentation. The boy was really intelligent, and the soundness of his nature was like the pure paste under a fine glaze. Colwyn had fished him out of a fog of family dullness, and pulled him up to a peak in Darien, and the adventure hadn't hurt him a bit. Indeed, the skill with which Colwyn had contrived to stimulate his curiosities without robbing them of their bloom of awe seemed to me a sufficient answer to Mulchard's ogreous metaphor. There was nothing hectic in Freham's efflorescence, and his old friend had not laid even a fingertip on the sacred stupidities. One wanted no better proof of that than the fact that Frenham still reverenced them in Colwyn. I'm gonna say this one thing. Edith Wharton's writing style is a delight. I am absolutely loving it. She has a marvelous writing style. I love it. There's a side of him you fellows don't see. I believe that story about the duel, he declared, and it was of the very essence of this belief that it should impel him. Just as our little party was dispersing, to turn back to our host with a joking demand, "And now you've got to tell us about your ghost." The outer door had closed on Murchan and the others. Only Frenham and I remained, and the devoted servant who presided over Colwyn's destinies, having brought a fresh supply of soda water, had been lacal- lacal- sorry, laconically ordered to bed. Colwyn's sociability was a night blooming flower, and we knew that he expected the nucleus of his group to tighten around him after midnight. But Freham's appeal seemed to disconcert him comically, and he rose from the chair in which he had just reseated himself after his farewells in the hall. "My ghost? Do you suppose I'm fool enough to go to the expense of keeping one of my own, when there are so many charming ones in my friends' closets? Take another cigar," he said, revolving toward me with a laugh. Frenham laughed too, pulling up his slender height before the chimney piece as he turned to face his short, bristling friend. "Oh, Oh, he said, you'd never be content to share if you met one you really liked. Oh no, wait. Fraham. That's Fraham. Oh, he said, you'd never be content to share if you met one you really liked. Colwyn had dropped back into his armchair, his shock head embedded in the hollow of worn leather, his little eyes glimmering over a fresh cigar. Liked? Liked? Good Lord! He growled. Ha! You have, then! Frenham pounced on him in the same instant, like with a side glance of victory at me. But Colwyn cowered gnome-like among his cushions, disassembling himself in a protective cloud of smoke. What's the use of denying it? You've seen everything, so of course you've seen a ghost. His young friend persisted, talking intrepidly into the cloud. Or, if you haven't seen one, it's only because you've seen two. The form of the challenge seemed to strike our host. He shot his head out of the where was I? There I am. He shot his head out of the mist with a queer tortoise-like motion he sometimes had, and blinked approvingly at Fenham. That's it! He flung at us on a shrill jerk of laughter. It's only because I've seen two. The words were so unexpected that they dropped down and down into a deep silence, while we continued to stare at each other over Colwyn's head, and Colwyn stared at his ghosts. At length Fenham, without speaking, threw himself into the chair on the other side of the hearth, and leaned forward with his listening smile. Drink of water? 2. Of course, they're not show ghosts. A collector wouldn't think anything of them. Don't let me raise your hopes. Their one merit is their numerical strength, the exceptional fact of there being two. But as against this, I'm bound to admit that at any moment I could probably have exercised them both by asking my doctor for a prescription, or my oculist for a pair of spectacles. Only, as I've never could make up my mind whether to go to the doctor or the oculist, whether I was afflicted by an optical or a digestive delusion, I had left them to pursue their interesting double life, though at times they made mine exceedingly uncomfortable. Yes, uncomfortable, and you know how I hate to be uncomfortable, but it was part of my stupid pride when the thing began, not to admit that I could be disturbed by the trifling matter of seeing two. And then I'd no reason really to suppose I was ill. As far as I knew, I was simply bored, horribly bored. But it was part of my boredom, I remember, that I was feeling so uncommonly well, and didn't know how on earth to work off my surplus energy. I had come back from a long journey down in South America and Mexico, and had settled down for the winter near New York with an old aunt who had known Washington Irving and corresponded with N.P. Willis. She lived not far from Irvington in a damp Gothic villa overhung by Norway spruces and looking exactly like a memorial emblem done in hair. Her personal appearance was in keeping with this image, and her own hair, of which there was little left, might have been sacrificed to the manufacture of the emblem. I had just reached the end of an agitated year, with considerable arrears to make up in money and emotion, and theoretically it seemed as though my aunt's mild hospitality would be as beneficial to my nerves as to my purse. But the deuce of it was that as soon as I felt myself safe and sheltered, my energy began to revive. And how was I to work it off inside a memorial emblem? I had at the time the illusion that sustained intellectual effort could engage a man's whole activity, and I decided to write a great book. I forget about what. My aunt, impressed by my plan, gave up to me her Gothic library, filled with classics bound in black cloth, and daguerreotypes of faded celebrities, and I sat down at my desk to win myself a place among their number. And to facilitate my task, she lent me a cousin to copy my manuscript. The cousin was a nice girl, and I had an idea that a nice girl was just what I needed to restore my faith in human nature, and principally in myself. She was neither beautiful nor intelligent. Poor Alice Norwell. But yeah. But it interested me to see any woman content to be so uninteresting, and I wanted to find out the secret of her content. In doing this, I handled it rather rashly, and put it out of joint. Oh, just for a moment. There's no fatuity in telling you this, for the poor girl had never seen anyone but cousins. I wonder what he did. Well, I was sorry for what I'd done, of course, and confoundedly bothered as to how I should put it straight. She was staying in the house, and one evening after my aunt had gone to bed, she came down to the library to fetch a book she'd mislaid, like any artless heroine, on the shelves behind us. She was pink-nosed and flustered, and it suddenly occurred to me that her hair, though it was fairly thick and pretty, would look exactly like my aunt's when she grew older. I was glad I had noticed this, for it made it easier for me to decide to do what was right, and when I had found the book she hadn't lost, I told her I was leaving for Europe that week. Europe was terribly far off in those days, and Alice knew at once what I meant. She didn't take it in the least as I expected it. It would have been easier if she had. She held the book very tight and turned away a moment to wind up the lamp on my desk. It had a ground glass shade with veined leaves and glass drops around the edge. I remember. Then she came back, held out her hand, and said, "Goodbye." And she said it. And as she said it, she looked straight at me and kissed me. I never felt anything as fresh and shy and brave as her kiss. It was worse than any reproach, and it made me ashamed to deserve a reproach from her. I said to myself, I'll marry her, and when my aunt dies, she'll leave us this house, and I'll sit here at the desk and go on with my book, and Alice will sit over there with her embroidery and look at me as she's looking now, and life will go on like that for any number of years. The prospect frightened me a little, but at the time it didn't frighten me as much as doing anything to hurt her. 10 minutes later she had my seal ring on her finger, and my promise that when I went abroad she would go with me. You'll wonder why I'm enlarging on this incident. It's because the evening on which it took place was the very evening on which I first saw the queer sight I've spoken of. Oh, thank you for the posture check, Julian. Oh, thank you. Being at that time an ardent believer in a necessary sequence between cause and effect, I naturally tried to trace some kind of link between what had happened to me in my aunt's library and what was to happen a few hours later on the same night. And so the coincidence between the two events always remained in my mind. Get another drink. I went up to my bed with rather a heavy heart, for I was bowed under the weight of the first good action I had ever consciously committed, and young as I was, I saw the gravity of my situation. Don't imagine from this that I had hitherto been an instrument of destruction. I had been merely a harmless young man who had followed his bent and declined all collaboration with Providence. Now I had suddenly undertaken to promote the moral order of the world, and felt a good deal like the trustful spectator who has given his gold watch to the conjurer, and I don't know in what shape he'll get, and doesn't know in what shape he'll get it back when the trick is over. Still, a glow of self-righteousness tempered my fears, and I said to myself as I undressed that when I'd got used to being good, it probably wouldn't make me as nervous as it did at the start. By the time I was in bed and had blown out my candle, I felt that I really was getting used to it, and that as far as I'd got, it was not unlike sinking down into one of my aunt's very softest wool mattresses. I closed my eyes on this image, and when I opened them, I must have been a good deal. It must have been a good deal later, for my room had grown cold and intensely still. I was waked by the queer feeling we all know, the feeling that there was something in the room that I hadn't been there when I fell asleep. I sat up and strained my eyes into the darkness. The room was pitch black, and at first I saw nothing. But gradually, a vague glimmer at the foot of the bed turned into two eyes staring back at me. I couldn't distinguish the features attached to them, but as I looked, the eyes grew more and more distinct. They gave out a light of their own. The sensation of being thus gazed at was far from pleasant, and you might suppose that my first impulse would have been to jump out of bed and hurl myself on the invisible figure attached to the eyes, but it wasn't. My impulse was simply to lie still. I can't say whether this was due to an immediate sense of the uncanny nature of the apparition, to the certainty that if I did jump out of bed I should hurl myself on nothing, or merely to the benumbing effect of the eyes themselves. They were the very worst eyes I've ever seen. A man's eyes. But what a man! My first thought was that he must be frightfully old. The orbits were sunk, and the thick red-lined lids hung over the eyeballs like blinds of which the cords are broken. One lid drooped a little lower than the other, with the effect of a crooked leer, and between these folds of flesh, with their scant bristle of lashes, the eyes themselves, small glassy discs with an agate-like rim, looked like sea pebbles in the grip of a starfish. But the age of the eyes was not the most unpleasant thing about them. What turned me sick was their expression of vicious security. I don't know how else to describe the fact that they seemed to belong to a man who had done a lot of harm in his life, but had always kept just inside the danger lines. They were not the eyes of a coward, but of someone much too clever to take risks, and my gorge rose at their look of base astuteness. And even that wasn't the worst, for as we continued to scan each other, I saw in them a tinge of derision, and felt myself to be its object. At that I was seized by an impulse of rage that jerked me to my feet and pitched me straight at the unseen figure. But of course, there wasn't any figure there, and my fists struck at emptiness. Ashamed and cold, I groped about for a match and lit the candles. The room looked just as usual, as I had known it would, and I crawled back to bed and blew out the lights. As soon as the room was dark again, the eyes reappeared, and I now applied myself to explaining them on scientific principles. At first I thought the illusion must have been caused by the glow of the last embers in the chimney, but the fireplace was on the other side of my bed, and so placed that the fire could not be reflected in my toilet glass, which was the only mirror in the room. Then it struck me that I might have been tricked by the reflection of the embers in some polished bit of wood or metal, and though I couldn't discover any object of the sort in my line of vision, I got up again, groped my way to the hearth, and covered what was left of the fire. But as soon as I was back in bed, the eyes were back at its foot. They were a hallucination, then, that was plain, but the fact that they were not due to any external dupery didn't make them a bit pleasanter. For if they were a projection of my inner consciousness, what the deuce was the matter with that organ? I had gone deeply enough into the mystery of morbid pathological states to picture the conditions under which an exploring mind might lay itself open to such a midnight admiration, but I couldn't fit it to my present case. I never felt more normal, mentally and physically, and the only unusual fact in my situation, that of having assured the happiness of an admirable girl, did not seem of a kind to summon unclean spirits about my pillow. But there were the eyes, still looking at me. I shut mine and tried to evoke a vision of Alice Nowell's. They were not remarkable eyes, but they were as wholesome as fresh water, and if she had had more imagination, or longer lashes, their expression might have been easy, interesting. As it was, they did not prove very efficacious, and in a few moments I perceived that they had mysteriously changed into the eyes at the foot of the bed. It exasperated me more to feel these glaring at me through my shut lids than to see them, and I opened my eyes again and looked straight into their hateful stare. And so it went on all night. I can't tell you what that night was like, nor how long it lasted. Have you ever lain in bed, hopelessly wide awake, and tried to keep your eyes shut, knowing that if you opened them, you'd see something you dreaded and loathed? It sounds easy, but it's devilishly hard. Those eyes hung there and drew me. I had the this is in French, so pardon me. Vertige de libre, les amber, and their red lids were the edge of my abyss. Julian 20, my life every night. Aww, I'm sorry to hear that. So this story must be familiar to you then. I had known nervous hours before, hours when I'd felt the wind of danger on my neck, but never this kind of strain. It wasn't that the eyes were awful; they hadn't they hadn't the majesty of the powers of darkness, but they had, how shall I say, a physical effect that was the equivalent of a bad smell. Their look left a smear like a snail's, and I didn't see what business they had with me anyhow, and I stared and stared, trying to find out. I don't know what effect they were trying to produce, but the effect they did produce was that of making me pack my portmanteau and bolt to town early the next morning. I left a note for my aunt explaining that I was ill and had gone to see my doctor. And as a matter of fact, I did feel uncommonly ill. The night seemed to have pumped all the blood out of me. But when I reached town, I didn't go to the doctor's. I went to a friend's rooms and threw myself on a bed and slept for 10 heavenly hours. When I woke, it was the middle of the night. I turned cold at the thought of what might be waiting for me. I sat up and shaking and stared into the darkness, but there wasn't a break in its blessed surface. And when I saw that the eyes were not there, I dropped back into another long sleep. Excuse me again. Sorry, just adjusting the way I'm seating. I had left no word for Alice when I fled, because I meant to go back the next morning, but the next morning I was too exhausted to stir. As the day went on, the exhaustion increased instead of wearing off, like the fatigue left by an ordinary night of insomnia. The effect of the eyes seemed to be cumulative, and the thought of seeing them again grew intolerable. For 2 days I fought my dread, and on the third evening I pulled myself together and decided to go back the next morning. I felt a good deal happier as soon as I decided, for I knew that my abrupt disappearance and the strangeness of my not writing must have been very distressing to poor Alice. I went to bed with an easy mind and fell asleep at once. But in the middle of the night, I woke, and there were the eyes. Well, I simply couldn't face them, and instead of going back to my aunt's, I bundled a few things into a trunk and jumped aboard the first steamer for England. I was so dead tired when I got on board that I crawled straight into my berth and slept most of the way over. And I can't tell you the bliss it was to wake from those long, dreamless stretches and look fearlessly in the dark, knowing that I shouldn't see the eyes. I stayed abroad for a year, and then I stayed for another, and during that time I never had a glimpse of them. That was enough reason for prolonging my stay if I'd been on a desert island. Another was, of course, that I had perfectly come to see on the voyage over the complete impossibility of my marrying Alice Nowell. The fact that I had been so slow in making the discovery annoyed me and made me want to avoid explanations. The bliss of escaping at one stroke from the eyes and from this other embarrassment gave my freedom an extraordinary zest, and the longer I savored it, the better I liked its taste. The eyes had burned such a hole in my consciousness that for a long time I went on puzzling over the nature of the apparition, and wondering if it would ever come back. But as time passed, I lost this dread, and retained only the precision of the image. Then that faded in its turn. The second year found me settled in Rome, where I was planning, I believe, to write another great book, a definitive work on Etruscan influences in Italian art. At any rate, I'd found some pretext of the kind for taking a sunny apartment in the Piazza de Spagna, and dabbling about in the Forum, and there one morning a charming youth came to me. As he stood there in the warm light, slender and smooth and high... Sorry, I know this word, I'm trying to get the word. And I just lost my place. Hyacinth. Hyacinthine. He might have stepped from a ruined altar, one to Antinous, say, but he'd come instead from New York with a letter from, of all people, Alice Nowell. The letter, the first I'd had from her since our break, was simply a line introducing her young cousin Gilbert Noyes and appealing to me to befriend him. It appeared, poor lad, that he had talent and wanted to write, and an obdurate family having insisted that his calligraphy should take the form of double entry. Alice had intervened to win him 6 months' respite, during which he was to travel abroad on a meagre pittance, and somehow prove his ability to increase it by his pen. The quaint conditions of the test struck me first, seemed about as conclusive as a medieval ordeal. Then I was touched by her having sent him to me. Sorry, having a little drink of water. I had always wanted to do her some service, to justify myself in my own eyes rather than hers, and here was a beautiful occasion. I imagine it's safe to lay down the general principle that predestined geniuses don't, as a rule, appear before one in the spring sunshine of the Forum looking like one of its banished gods. At any rate, poor Noyes wasn't a predestined genius, but he was beautiful to see, and charming as a comrade. It was only when he began to talk literature that my heart failed me. I knew all the symptoms so well, the things he had in him, and the things outside him that impinged. That's the real test after all. It was always punctuality, inevitably, with the exorbitancy of a mechanical law. It was always the wrong thing that struck him. I grew to find a certain fascination in deciding in advance exactly which wrong thing he'd select, and I acquired an astonishing skill at the game. The worst of it was that his bêtise wasn't of the too obvious art. Ladies who met him at picnics thought him intellectual, and even at dinners he passed for clever. I, who had him under the microscope, fancied now and then that he might develop some kind of a slim talent, something that he could make do and be happy on. And wasn't that, after all, what I was concerned with? He was so charming, he continued. He was so charming, he continued to be so charming, that he called forth all my charity in support of this argument, and for the first few months I really believed there was a chance for him. Those months were delightful. Noise was constantly with me, and the more I saw of him the better I liked him. His stupidity was a natural grace. It was as beautiful and well, it was as beautiful really as his eyelashes. And he was so gay, so affectionate, and so happy with me that telling him the truth would have been about as pleasant as slitting the throat of some gentle animal. At first I used to wonder what had put into that radiant head the detestable delusion that it held a brain. Then I began to see that it was simply protective mimicry, an instinctive ruse to get away from family life and an office desk. Not that Gilbert didn't, dear lad, believe in himself. There wasn't a trace of hypocrisy in him. He was sure that his call was irresistible, while to me it was the saving grace of his situation that it wasn't, and that a little money, a little leisure, and a little pleasure would have turned him into an inoffensive idler. Unluckily, however, there was no hope of money, and with the alternative of the office desk before him, he couldn't postpone his attempt at literature. The stuff he turned out was deplorable, and I see now that I knew it from the first. Still, the absurdity of deciding a man's whole future on a first trial seemed to justify me in withholding my verdict, and perhaps even in encouraging him a little, on the ground that the human plant generally needs warmth to flower. At any rate, I proceeded on that principle, and carried it to the point of getting his term of probation extended. When I left Rome he went with me, and we idled away a delicious summer between Capri and Venice. I said to myself, if he has anything in him, it will come out now. And it did. He was never more enchanting and enchanted. There were moments of our pilgrimage when beauty born of murmuring sound seemed actually to pass into his face, but only to issue forth in a flood of the palest ink. Well, the time came to turn off the tap, and I knew there was no hand but mine to do it. We were back in Rome, and I had taken him to stay with me, not wanting him to be alone in his pension when he had to face the necessity of renouncing his ambition. More water. I hadn't, of course, relied solely on my own judgment in deciding to advise him to drop literature. I had sent his stuff to various people, editors and critics. I had always sent it back with the same chilling lack of comment. Really, there was nothing on earth to say. I confess I never felt more shabby than I did on the day when I decided to have it out with Gilbert. It was well enough to tell myself that it was my duty to knock the poor boy's hopes into splinters, but I'd like to know what act of gratuitous cruelty hasn't been justified on that plea. I've always shrunk from usurping the functions of Providence, and when I have to exercise them, I decidedly prefer that it shouldn't be on an errand of destruction. Besides, in the last issue, who was I to decide, even after a year's trial, if poor Gilbert had it in him or not? The more I looked at the part I'd resolved to play, the less I liked it, and I liked it still less when Gilbert sat opposite me with his head thrown back in the lamplight just as Phil's is now. I've been going over his last manuscript, and he knew it, and he knew that his future hung on my verdict. We tactically agreed on that. The manuscript lay between us on my table. A novel. His first novel, if you please, and he reached over and laid his hand on it and looked up at me with all his life in the look. I stood up and cleared my throat, trying to keep my eyes away from his face and on the manuscript. The fact is, my dear "Dear Gilbert," I began. I saw him turn pa- I saw him turn pale, but he was up and facing me in an instant. "Oh, look here, don't take on so, my dear fellow. I'm not so awfully up as all that." His hands were on my own shoulders, and he was laughing down on me from his full height, with a kind of mortally stricken gaiety that drove the knife into my side. He was too beautifully brave for me to keep up with. He was too beautifully brave for me to keep up any humbug about my duty. And it came over me suddenly how I should hurt others in hurting him. Myself first, since sending him home meant losing him, but more particularly poor Alice Nowell, to whom I had so longed to prove my good faith and my desire to serve her. It really seemed like failing her twice to fail Gilbert. But my intuition was like one of those lightning flashes that encircle the whole horizon. Excuse me. And in the same instant I saw what I might be letting myself in for if I didn't tell the truth. I said to myself, I shall have him for life. And I'd never yet seen anyone, man or woman, whom I was quite sure of wanting on those terms. Well, the impulse of egotism decided me. I was ashamed of it. To get away from it, I took a leap that landed me straight in Gilbert's arms. "The thing's all right, and you're all wrong," I shouted up at him, and as he hugged me, I laughed and shook in his clutch. I had for a minute the sense of self-complacency that is supposed to attend the footsteps of the just. Hang it all, making people happy has its charms. Gilbert, of course, was for celebrating his emancipation in some spectacular manner, but I sent him away alone to explore his emotions, and went to bed to sleep off mine. As I undressed, I began to wonder what their aftertaste would be. So many of the finest don't keep. Still, I wasn't sorry, and I meant to empty the bottle, even if it did turn a trifle flat. After I got into bed, I lay for a long time smiling at the memory of his eyes, his blissful eyes. Then I fell asleep, and when I awoke, the room was deathly cold, and I sat up with a jerk, and there were the other eyes. It was 3 years since I'd seen them, but I thought of them so often that I fancied they could never take me unawares again. Now, with their red sneer on me, I knew that I had never really believed they would come back, and that I was as defenseless as ever against them. Oh, hello there, Kintron. Welcome. You're just in time for our second story of. Oh, lovely, lovely, Kintron, lovely. Now, with their red sneer on me, I knew that I had never really believed they would come back, and that I was as defenseless as ever against them. As before, it was the insane irreverence of their coming that made it so horrible. What the deuce were they after, to leap out at me at such a time? I had lived more or less carelessly in the years since I'd seen them, though my worst indiscretions were not dark enough to invite the searchings of their infernal glare. But at this particular moment I was really in what might have been called a state of grace, and I can't tell you how the fact added to their horror. But it's not enough to say that they were as bad as before. They were worse. Worse by just so much as I've learned of life in the interval, by all the damnable implications of my wider experience read into them. I saw now what I hadn't seen before, that they were eyes which had grown hideous gradually, which had built up their baseness coil-wise, bit by bit, out of a series of small turpitude slowly accumulated through the industrious years. Yes, it came to me that what made them so bad was they've grown so bad so slowly. More drink. A lot of water for this stream. There they hung in the darkness, their swollen lids dropped across the little watery bulbs, rolling loose in the orbits, and the puff of flesh making a muddy shadow underneath. And as their stare moved with my movements, there came over me a sense of their tactic complacency, of a deep hidden understanding between us that was worse than the first shock of their strangeness. Not that I understood them, but that they made it so clear that some day I should. Yes, they were the worst part of it, decidedly, and it was the feeling that became stronger each time they came back. For they got into the damnable habit of coming back. They reminded me of vampires with a taste for young flesh. They seemed so to gloat over the taste of a good conscience. Every night for a month they came to claim their morsel of mine. Since I'd made Gilbert happy, they simply wouldn't loosen their fangs. The coincidence almost made me hate him, poor lad, fortuitous as I felt it to be. I puzzled over it a good deal, but I couldn't find any hint of an explanation except in the chance of his association with Alice Nowell. But then the eyes had let up on me the moment I had abandoned her, so they could hardly be the emissaries of a woman scorned, even if one could have pictured poor Alice charging such spirits to avenge her. That set me thinking, and I began to wonder if they would let up on me if I abandoned Gilbert. The temptation was insidious, and I had to stiffen myself against it. But really, dear boy, he was too charming to be sacrificed to such demons. And so, after all, I never found out what they wanted. Drink of water. Excuse me. 3. The fire crumbled, sending up a flash which threw into relief the narrator's gnarled face under its gray-black stubble. Pressed into the hollow of the chair back, it stood out an instant like an intaglio of yellowish red-veined stone, with spots of enamel for the eyes. Then the fire sank, and it became once more a dim, Rembrandtish blur. Phil Frenham, sitting in a low chair on the opposite side of the hearth, one long arm propped on the table behind him, one hand supporting his thrown-back head and his eyes fixed on his old friend's face, had not moved since the tale began. He continued to maintain his silent immobility after Colwyn had ceased to speak, and it was I who, with a vague sense of disappointment at the sudden drop of the story, finally asked, "How long did you keep on seeing them?" Colwyn so sank into his chair that he seemed like a heap of his own empty clothes, stirred a little as if in surprise at my question. He appeared to have half forgotten what he had been telling us. "How long? Oh, off and on all that winter. It was infernal. I never got used to them. I grew really ill." Frenham shifted his attitude, and as he did so his elbow struck against a small mirror in a bronze frame standing on the table behind him. He turned and changed its angle slightly. Then he resumed his former attitude, his dark head thrown back on his lifted palm, his eyes intent on Colwyn's face. Something in his silent gaze embarrassed me, and as if to divert attention from it, I pressed on with another question. "And you never tried sacrificing Noyles?" "Oh, no, the fact is I didn't have to. He did it for me, poor boy." "Did it for you? How do you mean?" "He wore me out, wore everybody out. He kept on pouring out his lamentable twaddle, and hawking it up and down the place till he became a thing of terror. I tried to wean him from writing, oh, ever so gently, you understand, by throwing him with agreeable people, giving him a chance to make himself felt, to come to a sense of what he really had to give. I'd foreseen this solution from the beginning, felt sure that once the first ardor of authorship was quenched, he'd drop into his place as a charming parasitic thing, the kind of chronic cherubino for whom in old societies there's always a seat at table, and a shelter behind the lady's skirts. I saw him take his place as the poet who doesn't write. One knows the type in every drawing room. Living in that way doesn't cost much. I'd worked it all out in my mind, and felt sure that with a little help he could manage it for the next few years, and meanwhile he'd be sure to marry. I saw him ma- I saw him married to a widow, rather older, with a good cook and a well-run house. I actually had my eyes on the widow. Meanwhile, I did everything to help the transition. Lent him money to ease his conscience, introduced him to pretty women to make him forget his vows. But nothing would do him. He had but one idea in his beautiful, obstinate head. He wanted the laurel and not the rose, and he kept on repeating Gautier's axiom, and battering and filing at his limp prose till he'd spread it out all over Lord knows how many 100 pages. Now and then he would send a barrelful to a publisher, and of course it would always come back. At first it didn't matter. He thought he was misunderstood. He took the attitudes of geniuses, and whenever an opus came home he wrote another to keep it company. Then he had a reaction of despair, and accused me of deceiving him, and Lord knows what. I got angry at him, and told him it was he who had deceived himself. He'd come to me determined to write, and I'd done my best to help him. That was the extent of my offense, and I'd done it for his cousin's sake, not his. Excuse me. That seemed to strike home. I didn't answer for a minute. Then he said, "My time's up, and my money's up. What do you think I'd better do?" "I think you'd better not be an ass," I said. "What do you mean by being an ass?" he asked. I took a letter from my desk and held it out to him. "I mean refusing this offer of Mrs. Ellider's, to be her secretary at a salary of $5,000. There may be a lot more in it than that." "Oh, thank you. Oh, hello there, Jory Jelly. Welcome. Thank you for the raid. How are you doing?" Let's give a shout out to Jory Jelly. Jelly, what were you playing or reading or what were you doing, Jory Jelly? Greetings. Oh, Jellycat. Oh, it's Jellycat. Hello there, Jellycat. Greetings and salutations. It's you, Princess Jellycat. Oh my goodness, we are blessed by Princess Jellycat. Oh, Princess Jellycat, your sovereign. What were you playing this fine evening? I must know. Jellycat, we started with the Exit 8, then finally beat Final Fantasy 5. Congratulations! Wonderful! Well, I am honored to have you here, Princess Jellycat. We are on our final story for the evening, and thank you for the resubscription. We are almost done, but thank you for coming. Let us see. Oh my goodness. Oh no, I spit on my book. Oh dear, that's not good. Oh, oh no. Gotta be careful with this. He flung out his hand with a violence that struck the letter from mine. "Oh, I know well enough what's in it," he said, red to the roots of his hair. "And what's the answer, if you know?" I asked. He made none at the minute, but turned away slowly to the door. There, with his hand on the threshold, he stopped to say, almost under his breath, "Then you really think my stuff's no good?" I was tired and exasperated, and I laughed. I don't defend my laugh. It was in wretched taste. But I must plead in extentation that the boy was a fool, and that I'd done my best for him. I really had. He went out of the room, shutting the door quietly after him. That afternoon I left for Frascati, where I'd promised to spend the Sunday with some friends. I was glad to escape from Gilbert, and by the same token, as I learned that night, I had always so escaped from the eyes. I dropped into the same lethargic sleep that had come to me before when I left off seeing them. When I woke the next morning in my peaceful room above the Alexis, I left the other weariness and deep relief that always followed on that sleep. I put in 2 blessed nights at Frascati, and when I got back to my room in Rome, I found that Gilbert had gone. Oh, nothing tragic had happened. The episode never rose to that. He'd simply packed his manuscripts and left for America, for his family and the Wall Street desk. He left a decent enough note to tell me of his decision, and behaved altogether in the circumstances as little like a fool as it's possible for a fool to behave. Excuse me. 4. Colwyn paused again, and Frenheim still sat motionless, the dusky contour of his young head reflected in the mirror at his back. And what became of Noyes afterwards? I finally asked, still disquieted by a sense of incompleteness, by the need of some connecting thread between the parallel lines of the tale. Colwyn twitched his shoulders. Oh, nothing became of him, because he became nothing. There can be no question of becoming about it. He vegetated in an office, I believe, and finally got a clerkship in a consulate and married drearily in China. I saw him once in Hong Kong years afterward. He was fat and hadn't shaved. I was told he drank. He didn't recognize me. And the eyes? I asked, after another pause which Frenham's continued silence made oppressive. Cohen, stroking his chin, blinked at me meditatively through the shadows. I never saw them after my last talk with Gilbert. Put 2 and 2 together if you can. For my part, I haven't found the link. He rose, his hands in his pockets, and walked stiffly over to the table on which reviving drinks had been set out. You must be parched after this dry tale. Here, help yourself, my dear fellow. Here, fill. He turned back to the hearth. Frenham made no response to his host's hospital summons. He still sat in his low chair without moving. But as Colwyn advanced towards him, their eyes met in a long look. After which the young man, turning suddenly, flung his arms across the table behind him, and dropped his face upon them. Colwyn, at the unexpected gesture, stopped short, a flush on his face. Phil, what the deuce? Why have the eyes scared you? My dear boy, my dear fellow, I never had such a tribute to my literary ability, never. He broke into a chuckle at the thought and halted on the hearthrug, his hands still in his pockets, gazing down at the youth's bowed head. Then, as Frenheim still made no answer, he moved a step or 2 nearer. Cheer up, my dear Phil. It's years since I've seen them. Apparently I've done nothing lately bad enough to call them out of chaos, unless my present evocation of them has made you see them, which would be their worst stroke yet. His bantering appeal quivered off into an uneasy laugh, and he moved still nearer, bending over Frenham, and laying his grotty hands on the lad's shoulders. Phil, my dear boy, really, what's the matter? Why don't you answer? Have you seen the eyes? Frenham's face was still hidden, and from where I stood behind Colwyn I saw the latter, as if under the rebuff of this unaccountable attitude, drew back slowly from his friend. As he did so, the light of the lamp on the table fell full on his congested face, and I caught its reflection in the mirror behind Frenham's head. Colwyn saw the reflection also. He paused, his face level with the mirror, as if scarcely recognizing the countenance in it as his own. But as he looked, his expression gradually changed, and for an appreciative space of time he and the image in the glass confronted each other with a glare of slowly gathering hate. Then Colwyn let go of Frenham's shoulders and drew back a step. Frenham, his face still hidden, did not stir. And that was The Eyes. What an ending, my dear scholars. Ooh, that's quite chilling. Oh, oh, that was a twist at the end. That was brilliant. Oh, I liked that. That was a good ending. I did not expect that ending at all. So then, oh my goodness, woo, thrilling. So then, we will end the night there. Um, Unit 20, thank you very much. Oh, thank you. Abs. Oh, I'm ready for the story now. Oh, Abs. Oh, you just missed it. We are closing out for the night. Oh, but thank you for coming. I'm sorry, Abs. I'm sorry. Oh. But unfortunately, I don't think I could manage another story. Now with my voice. So, next week, we may have another um we may have another stream on Sunday. We'll see. We might do another reading stream with some more ghost stories, but that's a maybe. So I'll keep you informed. I'm not sure if something's going on this Friday. Maybe we'll see. So next week is going to be a short week. We're going to be doing more of Amnesia, the Dark. What was it? Amnesia, the Dark Descent on Tuesday, but there'll be no other stream other than that this week. I will be going on a little journey. So look forward to some pre-recorded streams and short stories for you while I'm gone. Um, so then, my dear scholars, let's see if there's anyone we can raid. It's fine night. Um, let's see if there's any other. Other ones. Anyone else? So it looks like let's go raid Drazov the Wicked. He is doing another reading stream. Let's see. It's always good to raid him. So then, my dear scholars, I say unto you, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, till we meet each other again at the study. Take care, and I shall see you next time. Till then, farewell and bye bye.